I had been a park ranger at Shenandoah National Park for just under a year when it all began. It was the kind of job I had taken to escape the frenzied pace of city life, a refuge from the constant noise, the ever-present rush, the ceaseless flow of people, and the clamor of modern society. Shenandoah's beauty had drawn me in, the sprawling vistas, the ancient trees, the soothing quiet of the wilderness that enveloped you the moment you stepped off the beaten path. The forest was pure, untouched in ways that the world outside seemed to have forgotten, but in hindsight I would come to understand that the wilderness, for all its majesty, can hold more than just peace. Sometimes it hides secrets, and danger can lie just beneath the surface. The day it happened started like any other, a typical May afternoon. The forest had come alive with the warmth of spring, the trees swelling with new growth and the vibrant green of fresh leaves, giving the entire park a rejuvenated, almost magical feel. The air was thick with the scent of earth and pine, the kind of smell that seemed to settle into your bones and bring a sense of calm. But it was the calm before the storm, the kind of tranquility that now feels far too deceptive. I had been assigned to patrol along the bridle trail that day, not far from Skyland Resort. It was one of those rare quiet moments, the sort where every little detail, the rustle of the wind, the occasional chirp of a bird, the distant murmur of the stream, seemed to echo louder than normal. I was out making my rounds, ensuring that hikers were following the park's rules, checking in on various campsites to make sure everyone was staying safe and respectful of the land. That afternoon I came across two women who had just set up camp. They were friendly, smiling in the warm sunlight, with their golden retriever happily bouncing around, carrying a stick in his mouth that seemed too big for him to handle. Julie and Loy. They introduced themselves, both with a relaxed energy that was so typical of the seasoned hikers I often encountered. They were dressed in comfortable clothes, backpacks resting on the ground, their campsite laid out neatly in a corner of the woods. The dog barked excitedly, running in circles. "Hey there," I called out, moving toward their campsite. "Everything going okay?" Julie looked up, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead, her face flushed with the warmth of the afternoon. She smiled, her green eyes sparkling. "Yeah, just getting settled in. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Sure," as I said, taking a moment to scan the area. The wind had picked up slightly, making the trees sway gently. "Just be sure to secure your food at night. Bears are starting to wake up from hibernation." Loy, who had been busy setting up the tent, looked up with a laugh. "Don't worry, we've got it all under control." "Thanks for the tip, though." With that I waved and moved on, continuing my patrol. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about their camp was too peaceful, almost too perfect. I brushed it off, chalking it up to overactive imagination. The park had a way of getting to you, making you start to see things that weren't there. But I was wrong. The next day I came back to check on their campsite. It wasn't far from the trail, and I made it a point to patrol this section regularly. But when I reached their camp, I immediately felt a chill. The site was abandoned, but it wasn't the usual quiet of a campsite being packed up that unnerved me. It was the mess their equipment was scattered, the tents left half dismantled, their backpacks strewn across the ground. The food was gone, and there was no sign of them. The silence was the worst part. It was heavy, as if the forest itself had gone still, holding its breath. I radioed it, and my voice taut with urgency. "This is Ranger Mark. I've got a situation near Bridle Trail. Something's wrong. The campsite is abandoned, and it doesn't feel right. I need immediate backup." The second stretched as I waited for a response. Moments later, the radio crackled back to life. "Copy that, Ranger Mark. We're on our way soon." The forest around me was filled with the sound of more rangers and law enforcement agents. We spread out, combing the area, searching for any clue that could explain what had happened. It wasn't long before we found something. The two women's bodies were discovered not far from their campsite, near a spot where a stream twisted its way through the forest. The soft gurgle of the water, once so soothing, now felt like a mocking Reminder of what had occurred. Julie and Loy had been brutally murdered. Their throats had been cut cleanly, and their bodies were bound with rope as if someone had taken the time to arrange them in a deliberate way. The sight of them lying there in the undergrowth, their eyes wide open, still frozen in shock, would haunt me for years. There was a brutal finality to it, a sense that these two women had been taken by something far more dangerous than any animal, far more calculating than anything the wilderness could produce. The investigation kicked off immediately. Forensic teams combed the site, lifting fingerprints, collecting hair and fiber samples. We interviewed anyone who had been in the park that day, hikers, resort staff, anyone who had passed through the area. Every conversation felt like a dead end. There were no clear leads, and the more we searched, the more elusive the answers became. The weeks that followed were filled with frustration as we tried to piece together the fragments of a case that seemed to be vanishing with each passing day. Then, just as we were beginning to lose hope, we got a lead, a cyclist who had been riding on the same trail days before the murders came forward, reporting an aggressive encounter with a man. The man had tried to run her off the road, screaming obscenities and acting irrationally. She described him as angry, wild-eyed, and with a volatile demeanor. His name was Daryl David Rice. When we tracked him down and brought him in for questioning, his demeanor was chilling. He was unnervingly calm. His eyes were cold, devoid of any real emotion, and his voice was flat, almost robotic, as he answered our questions. It was as if he was removed from the entire situation, detached from the horror he had undoubtedly caused. "Why did you do it?" I asked, sitting across from him in the sterile interrogation room. A tape recorder clicked on, capturing the tension in the air. He smirked. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. "I didn't do anything. You can't prove a thing." But the evidence spoke differently. His fingerprints matched those found at the crime scene, and witnesses had placed him near the area at the time of the murders. Despite his defiance, despite his chilling smirk, the case against him was solid. But it wasn't that simple. The trial, which followed in the months to come, would reveal just how complicated and frustrating the pursuit of justice could be. In the courtroom, prosecutors argued that the murders were a hate crime driven by animosity towards Julie and Elle's sexual orientation, but Daryl Rice denied this vehemently. He played the part of the victim, denying any involvement and challenging the case at every turn. His words echoed in the courtroom. "Prove it." He said it again and again like a mantra, daring the prosecution to find the evidence that would convict him in the end. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Rice was not convicted for the murders. Instead, he was convicted for the attempted abduction of the cyclist he had assaulted days earlier. The lack of concrete evidence directly linking him to Julie and Loy's deaths left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. We had caught the man we believed to be responsible, but the justice we had hoped for seemed incomplete. Hollow years passed since that terrible day, but I still patrol those same trails, though never alone. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow in the corner of my eye is a reminder of that day. The forest has changed for me. It is no longer just a place of beauty and tranquility. It is a place where danger can lurk without warning, hidden beneath the surface, just beyond the reach of the human eye. Every time I meet a new camper, a hiker, or a cyclist, I can't help but wonder about their stories. Are they just here for the peace, the fresh air, the beauty of the land? Or is there something more behind their eyes, something they won't ever speak of? The wilderness as a way of changing you. It makes you see the world differently. It teaches you that sometimes the things you should fear the most aren't the supernatural or the unknown. Sometimes the real danger comes from the people who walk among you, just like any other hiker or camper, blending into the landscape, but capable of the most unimaginable horror. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar fragrance that clung to my skin and filled my lungs with each breath I took. As a seasonal park ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park, I had come to cherish the solitude, the peaceful isolation that the wilderness provided. My days were spent patrolling the rugged trails, ensuring that the campers and hikers stayed safe, that the park's delicate ecosystem remained undisturbed. The beauty of the mountains, the sound of the wind whispering through the pines, the distant rumble of a thunderstorm rolling over the peaks, it all seemed so perfect. The park had a kind of timelessness and almost sacred feeling, but that summer of 1978 everything changed. At first it was subtle, just little things that didn't add up: a missing backpack here, a forgotten sleeping bag there, and occasionally an abandoned tent. I assumed it was the usual result of careless campers, or perhaps the occasional bear scavenging for food. It wasn't unusual for hikers to leave things behind, and the park was vast enough to hide any signs of a wild animal's pilfering. I wasn't concerned yet, but then came the first report of something more unusual, more troubling. A pair of seasoned hikers, just back from a week-long trip through the backcountry, came to the ranger station one afternoon. They were both visibly shaken, their faces pale and their eyes wide with unease. They sat in the small waiting area, their bodies stiff, as if they were afraid to let their guard down. "Something's wrong out there." The man, a grizzled fellow with a thick beard and the kind of weathered face that only years on the trail could produce, said. "We saw a man watching us. He was at the edge of the trees, just standing there, not moving." We tried to approach, but as soon as we did, he disappeared. His companion, a woman in her late 20s, nodded, her hands tightly gripping her backpack like a lifeline. It wasn't just that he was there, it was the way he looked at us, like he was waiting for something. I listened quietly, making notes, but I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just some random encounter. The man's description of the figure was vague but unsettling. He spoke of a tall, gaunt individual, a person who looked like they had been living off the land for far too long. The figure had wild, unkempt hair, a face that seemed to be nothing but sharp angles, and eyes that gleamed unnervingly in the fading light. The strange part was that he didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He simply stood there watching, waiting. Over the next few weeks, more reports came in, more hikers, more campers, all describing the same unsettling figure. They spoke of a man who appeared at dusk, always near the edge of the trees, never crossing into the open. He didn't approach, but he never left either. He was always just there, a constant silent presence at the edge of the park's vast, untamed wilderness. I couldn't dismiss these reports any longer. Something was wrong, but I still couldn't quite put my finger on it. People were afraid, but no one seemed to know what they were truly afraid of. Was it just a solitary figure, a hermit perhaps, or something darker? Then came Sarah and Mark. They were a young couple just looking for a weekend getaway. They'd driven up from Denver, eager to hike, camp, and enjoy the pristine wilderness. When they arrived at the ranger station, they were visibly shaken, their clothes dirty, their eyes wide with a kind of fear I couldn't understand. They didn't look like the kind of people who would be easily frightened, but there was no mistaking the terror in their eyes. "He was there," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We thought we were alone. We'd set up camp by the creek, just enjoying the quiet, but then we saw him standing in the trees watching us." Mark nodded, his face pale, his fists clenched. He didn't say anything, just stood there, but when he looked at us it felt like he knew us, like he was waiting for something. He had something in his hands wrapped in cloth, but we couldn't see what it was. Their words hit me like a punch to the gut. The description matched the others perfectly, down to the eerie stillness of the man, the feeling of being watched, but worse, the feeling of being hunted. I filed the report, my mind racing. Something about this was more than just a random stranger in the woods. There was a pattern emerging, something I couldn't ignore. I radioed for increased patrols, asking for help from the sheriff's department. We needed to tell this man before someone got hurt, but as the days passed I couldn't shake the sense that it was already too late. A few days later it happened. A hiker, alone and deep in the back country, stumbled upon a shallow grave. It was hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves and pine needles, barely visible unless you knew where to look. And inside the grave were the remains of a young woman, her body pale, her limbs twisted in unnatural angles, as though placed there with careful, deliberate intent. The local sheriff's department took over the investigation, but the park was suddenly a place of fear, of suspicion. Everyone from the seasoned rangers to the casual campers felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. I remember one patrol late at night when the moon was obscured by thick clouds. The world seemed to dissolve into darkness, the air heavy with the impending storm. The engine of my Jeep hummed softly as I drove along the winding forest roads, my headlights cutting through the blackness like a knife. The forest around me felt alive, as though it were watching, listening. I kept my speed slow, my senses alert, my mind constantly replaying the reports, the descriptions. The feeling of dread that had taken root in my chest, and then I saw it, movement at the edge of the road. My heart skipped a beat. I hit the brakes, the tires screeching. As I came to a halt there, just at the edge of the tree line, stood the figure, the same gaunt, thin man. His wild eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the light of my headlights like an animal's. He stood perfectly still, his clothes ragged and torn, his body too thin, as though life had been drained from him over months of living in the wilderness. In his hand he held something wrapped in cloth, just as Sarah and Mark had described. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I reached for my radio, my hand shaking as I pressed the button. Dispatch, this is Ranger 47. I've got a visual on the suspect. He's near mile marker 12, requesting immediate backup. But he didn't move, he didn't run, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a cold, empty stare that sent a chill straight to my bones. I reached for my sidearm, my hand trembling, put the knife down. I ordered Ed, my voice as steady as I could make it, "You're under arrest." But instead of complying, he slowly unwrapped the cloth. My heart slammed in my chest as the object inside came into view, a large, wickedly sharp knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the dim light. It was stained with what looked like dry blood, a sickening shade of brown that made my stomach twist. "Don't come any closer," I warned, my voice low, my finger resting on the trigger of my weapon. "Put it down." He didn't respond. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. I could smell him now, a nauseating mix of sweat, dirt, and something more, something metallic. I wanted to recoil, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, just as I was about to make my move, the unmistakable wail of sirens cut through the air. The backup had arrived. 2 sheriff's cars came barreling down the road, lights flashing, sirens screaming. The man didn't resist as they pulled him from the shadows and cuffed him, his expression eerily calm, as though he had been expecting this all along. The investigation that followed uncovered a truth so horrifying it sent shivers through my bones. His name was Thomas. He had been living in the park for months, completely off the grid, stealing from hikers and campers to survive. He had been responsible for the murder of the young woman whose body had been found in the shallow grave. But that wasn't the worst of it. Over the past 2 years, several other people had gone missing in the park, their disappearances unexplained. Thomas was the one who had taken them one by one, luring them into the wilderness. And why? What had driven him to this? The answers weren't clear. It turned out that Thomas was a fugitive wanted for a violent crime in another state, and the park had seemed like the perfect hiding place. But the killings were something different, something darker, something more personal. The trial was a media friend. Why? The details that came to light were gruesome beyond belief. The park, once a sanctuary, was forever tainted by what had happened there. Thomas was sentenced to life in prison, but the memory of that summer haunted me for years. Even now, decades later, I still think about those nights, those dark, oppressive nights when the park felt like it was holding its breath, the dread that I couldn't shake, the feeling that something was out there, something human and terrifying, stalking the quiet wilderness. The woods were no longer a sanctuary for me. They were a reminder that darkness can lurk anywhere, even in the most beautiful places. And sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't a bear, a cougar, or a wolf. It's a man.